Greetings, everyone from New Zealand, cold, blustery Dunedin. If you're watching this, I presume that there has been a technological issue, most likely my fault, so I apologize for that if that's the case. My name is Dr. Sebastian Potgieter. I'm from the University of Otago, based in the School of Physical Education, Sport and Exercise Sciences. And today I'll be presenting a paper which I have, or which we are rather in the process of co-authoring, I along with my colleague, Associate Professor Mark Falkus, who's in the audience today. And what I'll be presenting on is the shifting constructions of the sporting past, and particularly narrating the 1981 Springbok Rugby Tour of New Zealand. And broadly, what we've sought to explore in this paper is some of the complexities of how the sporting past is constructed, narrated, and represented as history. And specifically, we are interested in the extent to which histories of the same event shift over time, what these shifts are influenced by, and what ends they serve. And we are guided by the notion that there exists a difference between the past and history, and that inevitably historians exist intertextually within their social and political environments, meaning that the past is never discovered, set aside from contemporary contexts in which historians write. And in the process of reconstructing the past as history, historians engage in a selection of certain facts, certain tropes, narratives, and argumentative structures, which in turn produce partial and selective representations characterized as much by their inclusions as by their silences, their omissions, and their redactions. Now, to illustrate this point, we have deconstructed histories of an apartheid-era rugby tour by the South African national team called the Springboks to New Zealand in 1981. And the tour catalyzed major protests amongst New Zealanders as the legitimacy of hosting representatives of a racist regime became increasingly contested. And across its 56-day duration, more than 150,000 New Zealanders publicly and sometimes violently clashed with one another and with police. Those who opposed the tour attempted to scuttle it by trying to invade venues where matches were being played, and some of the more ardent protesters even threatened to fly a light aircraft into a stadium grandstand should a match not be called off. And simultaneously, fans of rugby packed the stadiums and supported the Springbok tour. And by the time the Springboks departed New Zealand, the anti-tour movement encompassed the largest anti-apartheid protests outside of South Africa. Now, nearly 4.5 decades since its occurrence, the tour remains an important cultural reference point and is very much embedded within the national imagination. And it continues to be something that New Zealand's journalists, its historians, its filmmakers, and its politicians turn to, and is commonly recalled in nation-defining terms as a watershed moment which influenced the nation's trajectory. Now, in this paper, we are less interested in the facts of the tour, but instead we are interested in how histories of the event have shifted and what this tells us about the way in which meaning is imposed upon the past in the present. So in canvassing nearly 45 years worth of histories pertaining to the events of 1981, we've identified 3 epochs where the meanings attached to the tour have shifted, so much so that a new dominant narrative emerges around the events, around its meaning, and around the significance of the events. Now, to conceptualize these shifts, we adopt a historiographical approach, which treats history as a discourse about the past, but which carries an inescapable ideological dimension. And we draw on the work of philosophers Hayden White and Keith Jenkins, who posit that historians read the past in ways not too dissimilar from how they read the present, and that therefore, as present values and material contexts shift, so does the way in which the past is read and represented. Now, this argument highlights for us that we cannot erase the historian from the histories they write, and that therefore the past is reconstructed in the present in ways which reflect usually dominant interests and values. Therefore, the narratives produced around 1981 across more than 4 decades fundamentally reflect the material contexts and the power relations within which they were produced. Now, we focus specifically on one form of representation, which is popular sports history writing. And while academics have arguably tended to not give all that much consideration to these types of histories, they are an important site for scholarly study for a number of reasons. Firstly, they typically favor content that has wide appeal and is easily digestible, and therefore the perspectives they provide on social issues are probably more influential because they simply reach a far wider audience than academic texts do. And secondly, they serve as an important means of widely propagating dominant ideologies and constructions of national identity. So therefore, we posit that how popular histories have represented 1981 is underscored by shifting material contexts, either in New Zealand or South Africa, and that these shifts tell us something about mutating evocations of national identity in New Zealand during a given period. And the dominant narratives which emerge from each period evoke a very different, even conflicting understanding of the tour by selectively highlighting certain parts of the past while silencing and redacting alternate readings. Now, the initial representations that emerged following the tour's conclusions were predominantly authored by the activists who opposed the tour. Within 3 years of the tour concluding, no less than 12 books had been published on the events, and typically they construct the tour as the final chapter of 3 decades of growing discontent within New Zealand about the pursuit of rugby relations with apartheid South Africa. Now, these texts raise several critiques about both the tour and rugby. Firstly, they politicize rugby's ties with South Africa as a collaboration with apartheid. They identified rugby as a pillar upon which white confidence in apartheid rested, raising the specter that the continuation of rugby ties with South Africa were lessening pressure for political reform. Secondly, they represent the tour as bringing to the fore New Zealand's own problematic social climate. So they question the place of rugby as a cherished national institution and critique the culture of hegemonic masculinity, patriarchal oppression, violence and corporeal risk, and conservatism, which claimed that apartheid was a political problem that existed outside of the realm of sport. Now, these accounts also frame the tour as evidence of New Zealand's own racism, and Indigenous groups in particular identified with the treatment of Black South Africans and questioned the readiness with which white New Zealanders opposed apartheid, and yet were less concerned with domestic colonial legacies. So the dominant representation which emerges of the tour during this first epoch is that it was symptomatic of a larger social decay within New Zealand society, and therefore rugby and the 1981 event itself are recurringly troped as innately political. Now, much of the anti-tour literature disappears around the mid-1980s, and increasingly it is texts that get devoted to liturgizing rugby's place in New Zealand, which tend to represent the events. And following the somewhat unstable position of rugby in the years surrounding the 1981 tour, a notable trend of rehabilitating the image of the game emerges across these texts. Now, arguably, this shift in narrative is underscored by the material developments around rugby in the late 1980s. Perhaps most significantly, New Zealand both hosted and won the inaugural Rugby World Cup in 1987, a tournament from which South Africa was excluded. And the New Zealand team also comprised a significant number of new players who were untainted by either having played in 1981 or having participated in a divisive unsanctioned tour of South Africa in 1986. And the tournament was very much heralded as an unequivocal celebration of the game in New Zealand. And the New Zealand coach even commented at the time that many of the players felt that for the first time in years, the country was actually behind them. Now, this arguably precipitated a new climate in which rugby could be rehabilitated as a nationally cohesive and venerable institution, which therefore influenced how 1981 was represented. So the dominant narrative inscribed by this literature emerging during this period depoliticizes both rugby and New Zealand's connections with apartheid. It's a narrative that is highly critical of the anti-tour movement, and which gets represented as having damaged a New Zealand way of life. And protesters were simply intruders who were bent on disruption and whose objections actually had very little to do with apartheid. And the anti-tour movement was an example of political interference in sport, and any allegations that playing rugby against South Africa were obviously nonsensical. So in the face of the critical narratives produced immediately following the tour, the texts from this epoch retort that sport and politics did not and should not mix, whereby any criticism of rugby could be dismissed as an illegitimate politicization. So the dominant narrative that emerges during this period is devoid of any critical excavation of New Zealand society or the place of rugby within it. And instead, rather, they rehabilitate rugby as a cherished and infallible national institution rather than meaningfully assessing the tour or its wider significance. So any criticisms of rugby are redacted in favor of celebratory, apolitical, and ahistorical tropes, and things which complicate or contradict this representation of rugby simply get silenced through exclusion. Now, political changes in South Africa subsequently represent a new set of material contexts which had implications for how the 1981 tour was represented in New Zealand again. In April 1994, South Africa held its first non-racial democratic elections, signaling the formal end of apartheid. And this came with the tacit recognition that protesters in 1981 had been right and that the tour had been problematic, so much so that then Prime Minister Jim Bolger issued a retrospective apology to Nelson Mandela for the 1981 tour and New Zealand's rugby ties with apartheid. And in response to these changes in material contexts, the tour once again becomes re-represented in New Zealand and given new meaning, which has influenced largely how the events are contemporarily understood. So rugby is represented as having helped tear down apartheid. The Springboks get reimagined as a visible manifestation of apartheid, and protesters are labeled as having been right for opposing the tour and as having sent a global warning to others considering playing sport with apartheid. So the dominant narrative which emerges around 1981 and rugby following the collapse of apartheid, and which largely remains the way in which these events are understood, is that this was an example of New Zealand's commitment to anti-racist values. However, as is much the case with the second epoch, this narrative is fundamentally shaped by what it doesn't say. So rugby in the tour gets selectively repoliticized, but in a way that constructs it as a nationally valorous institution by contributing to the collapse of apartheid. So rarely ever do these narratives raise that there was also substantial support for not only the tour, but retaining ties with South Africa and with apartheid specifically. And for instance, some of New Zealand's largest far-right groups were able to successfully generate political capital by supporting sporting ties with apartheid. And the domestic critiques raised by protesters, such as racism, gender politics, or conservatism, are silenced, and instead the anti-tour campaign is reimagined as solely an anti-apartheid campaign. So New Zealand's rugby ties with South Africa become reworked as a story of national values which oppose racial discrimination, and any controversies pertaining to race are located outside of New Zealand. So the tour and rugby ties with South Africa more broadly have been reworked into the dominant mythos of New Zealand as a culturally and racially inclusive society. So in this paper, what we've sought to interrogate is how history making is entangled with shifting evocations of nationhood and national identity at a particular moment in time. And while the chain of events of the 1981 tour can never change, history is seeking to explain the shift, or explain the tour rather, shift radically from initially politicizing rugby and its connections with apartheid to rehabilitating the game's image within New Zealand and to reimagining rugby as an anti-apartheid force. And each epoch tells a very different story about the tour and about why it mattered and about what lessons are to be taken from the tour for the present. So the dominant narrative which emerges across sort of 45 years are neither objective nor absolute nor authoritative. Rather, they are partial, they are filtered, they are ideological, and they are ultimately power-laden. And the way that 1981 has been represented in histories has tended to reflect ideological responses to a matrix of material contexts and or dominant discourses extant in New Zealand society at a particular moment in time. And contemporary representations of the tour served dominant discourses around New Zealand as a post-colonial nation committed to anti-racism and biculturalism. As material contexts change, though, we can expect that the tour will once again be imbued with new meaning. So this paper then is less about a rugby tour than it is about how histories get made and remade across different social contexts and what ends these constructions serve. So in this respect, for us, the true meaning of the 1981 tour is less important than how the event has been appropriated and the particular purposes that these representations serve across certain moments in time. Thank you for your attention, and we welcome any questions and any feedback on this project. Thank you very much.